Welcome back to Left Coast News. Today we've got a stack of bills that all have one thing in common: government growth. More taxes, more red tape, and more ways for the state to tell local communities and private citizens, we know better than you.
And it's packaged in the usual wrappers: affordable housing, public safety, privacy, worker protection, public health. The marketing is soft, but the impact is heavy.
We're going to cover about 10 bills and how they hit your wallet, your community, and basic accountability. It's a lot, but these are important.
Thanks for tuning in to leftcoastnews.net. News and information from the wacky, sometimes communist, liberal west coast of the United States. For more, visit leftcoastnews.net.
Senate Bill 5892, Voter Database Lockdown and Transparency Kill Switch.
Let's start here because this one should set off alarm bells for anyone who cares about election transparency. Senate Bill 5892.
This bill is sold as protecting the voter registration database, but what it really does is wall off election records from public oversight and centralized control at the Secretary of State.
Under SB 5892, huge categories of election-related records are explicitly exempt from public disclosure, including continuity of operations plans, security audits, risk assessments, and cybersecurity test results tied to election infrastructure.
They also block public access to voter signatures, ballot images, cast vote records, and even photographs of voted ballots, from the moment a ballot is returned all the way through its destruction.
Now here's where it gets worse. If someone submits a public records request to a county elections office, that county is prohibited from producing the records and must redirect the request to the Secretary of State.
So instead of local access, local accountability, and decentralized transparency, everything funnels upward to Olympia.
And if election official knowingly violates that requirement, now that's a Class C felony.
Let that sink in. The bill criminalizes the wrong kind of transparency while shielding the system itself from scrutiny.
Supporters will say this is about security. But here's the constitutional problem. You don't build trust by hiding the process. Transparency is the security.
And once records are exempted, centralized, and protected by felony penalties, citizens lose their ability to independently verify elections.
That's not election integrity. That's election control.
Senate Bill 5973, gutting the initiative process and weaponizing integrity. Moving on to one of the most dangerous bills in the entire package, Senate Bill 5973.
This bill directly targets the initiative and referendum process, which is literally enshrined in Article 2, Section 1 of the Washington Constitution, the people's reserved power.
First, Senate Bill 5973 bans per signature compensation for initiative and referendum signature gatherers, even indirect compensation tied to output.
They claim this prevents fraud, but here's the reality. This means citizen-led initiatives dramatically more expensive, harder to organize, and easier for wealthy insiders to dominate.
And it doesn't stop there. The bill authorizes citizen lawsuits against initiative sponsors and signature gathering entities, with civil penalties up to $10,000 per violation, plus attorney's fees.
That's lawfare, pure and simple.
Then comes the real gut punch. Before an initiative can even receive a ballot title, the sponsors must now collect 1,000 voter signatures up front just to file the measure.
So the state gets to decide whether your idea even qualifies to be described to voters, unless you clear a new government-approved support threshold.
That's a fundamental shift. The initiative process was designed to bypass the legislature, not ask for its permission.
They justify this by claiming too many initiatives get filed. Translation: too many citizens are using the tools the Constitution gave them.
Let's be honest, this bill didn't come out of nowhere. It comes after several citizen-backed initiatives embarrassed the legislature and threatened entrenched policy agendas.
This is the political class protecting itself by shrinking direct democracy under the banner of integrity. HB 2559, short-term rental tax.
Next up, HB 2559. Speaking of entrenched policy agendas, this is the classic, we'll fix housing by taxing something else.
Here's what it does. Starting April 1st, 2027, a county, city, or town can slap a short-term rental tax up to 4% collected by the Department of Revenue.
And they'll say, don't worry, it's for housing. The revenue goes into a new account for essential affordable housing, and the list includes construction, operations, rental assistance, and funding organizations that provide housing services.
But here's the part people need to hear. The local government can keep up to 15% off the top for administration. So you're taxed, and then you're taxed again through bureaucracy.
And this hits real people, families trying to travel cheaper, working folks visiting relatives, and small hosts renting a room or a cabin to cover the mortgage.
It also becomes a permanent political pipeline, a new tax, a new account, and a new annual report requirement that sounds like accountability but often turns into a paper shield.
The bigger question, if housing is the crisis, why are we always funding programs around the crisis instead of confronting permitting, zoning, and government-created scarcity?
HB 2442, local flexibility equals taxing authority. Next up, HB 2442, the title is basically a confession, providing local governments tax resources and fund flexibility.
Translation, local governments want more ways to take money, and the state wants to hand them the tools.
One clear piece, it authorizes a local sales tax and use tax for services for children and families at up to 0.01%. And yes, they'll say that's tiny, but here's the conservative warning. Tiny taxes stack up. They never get smaller, they only multiply.
And it's paired with other tax and levy edits across multiple statutes. That's how you get long-term drifts, dozens of little changes that add up to very different tax reality.
There's also language in the excerpted section tying county tax revenue to utility relief, requiring 0.2% of revenue to assist low-income residents with utility costs.
Even when the goal sounds compassionate, it's still government designing mandatory carve-outs instead of fixing why utilities are crushing people in the first place.
And once again, new tax authority today becomes the baseline tomorrow. SB 5906, institutional sanctuary rules.
Now let's talk about Senate Bill 5906, which spreads immigration enforcement restrictions across early learning, schools, higher education, and even healthcare facilities.
For early learning and childcare, it restricts collecting immigration status documents, and it says immigration enforcement can't enter non-public areas without a valid judicial warrant, subpoena, or court order. It also pushes reporting requirements and know your rights materials established by the Attorney General.
Healthcare facilities must designate treatment and protected health info discussion areas as non-public, and they may not allow access for immigration enforcement purposes without a judicial warrant or court order that specifically grants access.
Higher education has a similar structure. Don't disclose personal info except in narrow cases, and only allow access to non-public campus areas with a judicial warrant, subpoena, or court order.
Now let's be careful. Nobody's saying schools should be chaotic or that kids should be traumatized. But this bill just isn't about order. It's about policy-driven resistance to enforcement, turning state institutions into buffers.
And politically, it's a statement. Washington is choosing institutional non-cooperation as a model. That affects public trust and it affects the rule of law. SB 5852, the AG inserts into employer federal compliance. SB 5852 is another protections bill, but it effectively places the Attorney General's office into the middle of employer interaction with federal agencies.
The bill requires that the AG issue guidance by July 1st, 2026 to clarify employers' rights to restrict access to non-public areas in a place of labor, and to publish it broadly and in multiple languages.
And the excerpt shows it restricting voluntary consent for federal agencies to access or obtain worker records.
Here's the conservative concern. You create legal landmines for employers who are trying to follow federal rules, while the state frames any cooperation as suspect.
And what happens in reality? Businesses either lawyer up, which costs money, or they avoid hiring risk categories entirely. The state claims it's protecting workers, but it can backfire into less opportunity and more compliance fear. HB 2439, the Vapor Tobacco Regulation plus CPA hammer.
On we go with House Bill 2439. This one is a heavy regulatory hit on vapor products.
It bans entertainment vapor products, devices with interactive gaming or entertainment features starting January 1st, 2027. It also bans imitation vapor products that mimic candy, desserts, school supplies, or characters that appeal to minors.
They also move enforcement into Consumer Protection Act territory, making violations a per se CPA violation. That's not just regulation, that's a legal cudgel.
We can all agree minors shouldn't be targeted, but the way this is built, it's designed for maximum enforcement pressure, and it puts retailers and small businesses under the microscope. It also raises the licensing fees for vapor distributors from $100 a year to over $1,000 a year. And this is on top of the 95% nicotine tax that applies to vapor products we talked about in an earlier video.
And in Washington, when enforcement expands, it rarely shrinks.
SB 5925, Attorney General Civil Investigative Demands Expansion. Next up, SB 5925, and this one is basically a power-up for the Attorney General's office.
It authorizes the AG to issue written civil investigative demands, documents, oral testimony, written interrogatories, while investigating possible violations tied to both constitutions and a list of statutes and chapters in state law.
So the AG can demand records or testimony before a civil case is even filed.
And here's the part people need to understand. These demands can include a gag order, if a court approves it, and if you disclose the existence or content of that demand, it can be charged as a misdemeanor for most recipients.
So if you're on the receiving end, you can be forced to comply and potentially prohibited from even telling anyone you got hit with it.
That's a serious transparency problem because it creates government investigations that operate in the dark while still imposing real burdens on private citizens, businesses, and organizations.
And the bill explicitly says this isn't for criminal prosecutions, but it still allows the AG to build a civil enforcement machine with coercive discovery tools. HB 2102, the legal financial obligations null and void and mandatory waivers.
Hang on, we're getting close to the end of the list, but we can't let this one go. HB 2102 deals with legal financial obligations, LFOs.
The bill says that certain previously imposed judgments for costs, fees, and interest eliminated or repealed by the Act become not enforceable after the effective date, and that any such debts are considered null, void, satisfied, and paid in full.
It also bars the court from accepting payments for those costs, fees, or accrued interest after their effective date.
Then it goes further. On motion of an offender, the court shall waive all uncollectible portions of LFOs, including accrued interest or restitution, and restitution LFOs, and it even allows an administrative process to waive certain outstanding debt.
Conservatives should be skeptical here, because when you erase financial accountability broadly, you shift costs, either to victims, to taxpayers, or to the system overall.
And this is exactly how you get policy that sounds compassionate, but can create downstream impacts on restitution expectations, court funding structures, and public confidence and consequences. And just in case we weren't clear, this bill is targeted towards offenders who are being charged or released from prison, that their financial obligations to the state for their crimes will no longer be collectible. Washington's always thinking about the criminals. All right, on to SB 6045, the agricultural collective bargaining under PERC plus card cross-check interest arbitration. We're almost done now. SB 6045 is a major restructuring of labor rules for agriculture.
This bill explicitly says it extends collective bargaining rights to agricultural employees.
So we're talking about farm field hands that will be placed in a state union. It places this under the Public Employment Relations Commission, PERC, and sets up a framework for certification and disputes.
Here's the key. PERC can determine the bargaining representative either through a cross-check process or an election.
And cross-check is basically card check logic. If a farm worker labor organization meets certain conditions, PERC can certify representation by comparing authorization cards against employer records. And certification can occur on a showing of interest from more than 50% of agricultural employees.
Then the bill goes into heavy enforcement and remedies. PERC can order cease and desist, reinstatement, damages, and it references attorney fees in certain wage recovery contexts.
And if bargaining doesn't conclude, disputes can get shoved into interest arbitration, meaning an arbitrator can impose contract terms.
So the concern is straightforward: more bureaucracy, more mandatory processes, and more pressure on employers, especially smaller agricultural operators, with real costs and operational impacts.
This will be a death sentence to small farms in this state if that passes. All right, HB 2400, social media content creation and regulation, registration plus trust accounts, and platform reporting.
One of our final bills hits close to home for creators, House Bill 2400.
It defines content creator broadly, specifically including podcasters, influencers, streamers, and creates a new regulatory scheme under Title 19.
The bill treats certain vloggers as engaged in business activity and requires registration with the Department of Revenue if they have substantial nexus and receive $12,000 or more in compensation from compensated social media video content in the previous 12 months.
Then it goes after family content. If a minor child's likeness, name, photo appears in a compensated segment, the social media service or advertiser must set up and fund a trust account using a pro rata percentage tied to how much the child appears or is referenced.
And it also forces platforms to submit annual reports starting April 1st, 2027 with account counts, Washington-based creator counts, minors, and even advertising revenue tied to creator content and categories.
Conservative read. This is another example of the state expanding its footprint into speech-adjacent activity, especially when the definitions are broad enough to sweep up normal online creators. HB 2148, the Pay It Forward program, grad tuition assistance, income-based repayment to state fund. Okay, last one. I know it was a lot today, but HB 2148 is creating the Pay It Forward program.
It creates a program to provide tuition assistance to graduate students administered by the Washington Student Achievement Council.
Students receive funds for tuition and fees, and in return they sign a binding contract to make contributions starting 1 year after graduation or leaving the program.
It's income-based. The analysis spells out caps like UWWSU participants may not be required to contribute more than 5% of income. Several other public universities capped at 3.5%, and contributions can't exceed 15 years.
Conservative concern? Programs like this tend to become permanent pipelines that grow government-administered funding and repayment structures, and the state becomes the middleman in higher ed finance instead of addressing the cost drivers directly.
When you step back and look at what we just walked through, not the spin, not the headlines, but the actual bill language, a very clear picture comes into focus.
This isn't about one bad idea, it's about a governing philosophy.
You see it in Senate Bill 5925, where the Attorney General is given pre-case investigative powers that can force compliance in silence with gag orders and penalties attached.
You see it in HB 2102, where legal financial obligations are wiped away wholesale. Accountability is erased retroactively, and the cost is quietly shifted away from the offenders and onto everyone else.
You see it in Senate Bill 6045, where agricultural, one of the most fragile, margin-tight industries in the state, is pulled into a PERC-controlled labor system with card check certification and forced arbitration.
You see it in HB 2400, where podcasters, streamers, influencers, and family creators suddenly become regulated entities with registration thresholds, trust mandates, and platform reporting, all wrapped around speech.
And you see it in House Bill 2148, where the state inserts itself as a long-term financial middleman between graduate students and their future income, instead of fixing why education costs are out of control in the first place.
Different policy areas, same results.
More centralized power,
Less transparency,
more government discretion.
less individual choice.
And once these systems are built, they don't shrink, they don't sunset, they don't self-correct.
They become permanent, and the people who voted for them are never the ones paying the price.
That's why this stuff matters before it passes.
So if you don't like where Washington is headed, don't wait until the consequences show up in your paycheck, your business, your farm, your platform, or your vote.
Read the bills, comment on the bills, testify when you can.
And most importantly, stop letting them tell you this is all harmless, temporary, or for your own good. Thanks for listening to Left Coast News. If you got anything out of this, please like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you next time.